Boker Tov, Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Pei Tes in Baba Basra, as we learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Asurim Batzar V'Shivya. The third line on the top of from the top of the page on Pei Tes gives us a long siman. The siman is where you have a little preamble and introduction to all the upcoming topics, and there's quite a few lines there. Ein Ma'anina, Ein Gochin, a garden. We don't know what those things are yet. A liter is a pound or a kilo, a weight measured. With litra shlosha. Eser, Nefesh, Mishkalos, Imachak, Ava, Losaso, Liasa, all those are preambles to various topics we're going to discuss today. Tanarabanim, in the sixth line on the page. We talked yesterday, yesterday's Mishnah is discussing about not cheating when it comes to weights and measures. Be careful what you do. So if the minhag is, you have to follow the custom of the place. If the minhag is that when you buy, let's say dry measure, wheat or whatever, seeds, whatever it is, and they heap it up, right? They give a little bit more to the purchaser. You heap it up a little bit. You fill the top and you heap it up. Then you have to leave it heaped up. If the minhag is that you level it off, then you level it off. Don't do the reverse. So that's what the Brisa says here in the first of the wide lines on Pei Testament off. In a place where they pile up, where they make a heap, you don't level it out. That's cheating the purchaser. On the other hand, you don't pile it up when the minhag is to level it off. That would be cheating the mocher, the seller. Tam lomer efa shlema. The pasuk says you must have an efa as a measure. So efa is a measure. Evan efa shlema. He must be a complete, a perfect measure. Don't cheat. What happens if he says, "I'll tell you what. I know the minhag here is to heap it up, but I'll level it off and I'll charge him a little bit less." Don't play that game. Some of them I'll charge him a little bit less, or the reverse. Normally they level off the measure, the dry measure, level it off from the top, and I'll give them a little bit extra. I'll add on. I'll charge him more. She'ain shomin. How do we know? Listen, Tamalomar, Eifa Shlema V'Tzedek Yelacha. Again, the pasuk says Eifa Shlema. You have to have a complete one. V'Tzedek Yelacha. And yesterday's daf on Amid Beis. So yesterday's daf it says V'Tzedek Yelacha Tzadek Mishacha V'Tein Lo. Right. Make it just. Make sure that you give them even of yours, some of yours, even with, give them a little bit extra to make sure that you don't cheat them. In other words, it's very hard to be perfect. So if you want to make sure that you don't cheat them, make sure you give them a little bit extra. How do you know that you don't give an exact in a place where you do give overweight? Here we're talking about a weight measure, not a volume measure, but a weight measure. And when you weight measure, of course, then they didn't have electronic scales. In those days, everything was a balance scale. So the way you do it is make sure that you give him a little bit extra. In other words, that you give him a little bit overweight, and so you give him a little bit more than the scale. So if you're giving him a kilo, make sure you give a little bit more than that by having the produce that you're weighing, make that come down a little bit, overweight a little bit, so that the kilo weight, the weight goes up a little bit, right? So you want to. That's called giving him overweight. So how do you know that in a place where they normally do that, that's what the minhag is, that they give them a little bit extra by making overweight? You don't give exact. And if the minhag is that you give the exact amount, you don't give them overweight. Again, Evan Shlema. You must have a complete stone, a perfect stone. The stone being over here, the stone that's used as the weight in the balance scale. And the same idea. How do you know that if a man says, "Well, I'll give you the exact weight without overweight, but some of them I'll charge him less," or the reverse, I'll give him overweight, meaning I'll give him more produce than the kilo. It says kilo, and give him kilo. I'll put the produce side of the scale a little bit heavier. It'll go down. Give him overweight there. How do I know that if you do that, below some I'll charge him with more she'ain shoma? You don't listen to him. Lomer Evan Shlema B'Tzedek. Again, a complete stone. And make it just. Don't cheat him at all. Make sure you don't cheat. Because you say, yeah, but what happens if I'm giving him more and I'll charge him a little bit more? But it's not going to be exact, right? You might overcharge him by a little bit. Do things exact as you can, giving, the human limitations. Do as much as you can to do it right. And since you can't do it right, make sure that you give him a little bit extra so that you didn't cheat the guy. I'm Rabbi Yehuda, Misura. And what was we saw in yesterday's daf, what was the idea? Why is cheating on weights and scales so terrible? Because you can't do tshuva. When you have your customers come in all day, the Gemara says it's worse even than Gilead Arayos, because in Gilead Arayos you could do tshuva. How do you do tshuva if you cheat hundreds and hundreds or thousands of people coming into your store? Tshuva, how are you going to do tshuva? Okay, so the Gemara says, what you should do is do acts of kindness to the tzibur, to the shul, paint the shul, do something nice for the shul. Sure, but that's not really the best way to complete. You haven't made up whole. The guy you cheated is not going to become whole by you doing nice things for the tzibur. Right? So the point is that this is a terrible sin. Amar B'Yehuda Misura. Amar B'Yehuda Misura. Lo yeh the pasuk says licha b'beischa efa v'efa. Don't have two different kinds of measures. Like people say, keeps two sets of books. One for the IRS and one for the real one. Well, he has two sets of measures also. An honest one when he's measuring it out for his family, and then a dishonest one. How do you? The pasuk says lo yeh b'beischa, and then it says, but he darshans. What's the darshan? You won't have anything in your house. Your house is going to be empty. You're going to lose your furniture, your money, everything. Why? Because because you have two different measures. When you cheat on measures, God punishes you by taking away your assets. Again, you won't have anything in your wallet, in your pocket. You won't have anything matam. You shouldn't have that because you keep two different stones. The pasuk goes on. If you have an honest stone, an honest measuring weight, then yibacha. Then you will. If you keep honest weights and measures, then you will. God will reward you with assets. If you have a proper measure, and Evan is the weight, and the Ephah is the measure, as dry measure and liquid measure, and we'll talk about that. Pardon? Very good. So we're going to talk about that too. They did have. They did have standards. The Gemara is going to talk about that later. That you're not allowed to keep certain kinds of measures that aren't exact, and sometimes they were stamped. Like a hechsher. Somebody came around hechsher. If you're in a store and you have a scale, even electronic ones today, not only is it certified by the manufacturer, but they come around and they check it. There's supervisors who come around and check it, like a shkocha. You have to have a check. You go to the elevator. They say they check the elevator. When you get in the elevator and it hasn't been checked in 10 years, take the stairs. You know what I'm saying? They always sign that. Or the public bathroom where they came to to clean it, they sign in there. They just sign and they leave. They don't do anything. But whatever. But there are standards. There's a bureau. What is it called in the United States? The Bureau of Standards and
Bureau of Weights and Standards.
Weights and Standards. They have a thing. They probably they have supervisors to go out and check. We're going to talk
in the diamond industry. They develop the electronics.
Electronic sales for small amounts. Yeah.
If you want, I can bring you one that you hold.
Yeah, you hold that. That's what we're going to talk about. That
you guys want to see it.
The Gemara's going to talk about that. You'll bring it in. Yeah, very good. The Gemara's going to talk about that. Yeah. Different sides. We're going to talk about those balance scales because in those days that's all they had to balance scales. There are many places where they still use balance scales. Certain places, I don't know, in the shuk or certain places, I've been in places where they still use balance scales. They don't use electronic scales. Not for for small things, but the fruits and vegetables I've seen. They pretty much standardize now. They do, but you remember times when they had balance. I remember times seeing here when they had balance scales. They have these measures. Who knows if those are honest measures? Tanur Rabbanan. Tanur Rabbanan. We're right below Rabbeinu Gershom. Where it says Rabbeinu Gershom right there in the Gemara. If you lost your place, Tanur Rabbanan. Oh, very good. Teaches us. Teaches us that they set up right. They set up supervisors. A gardaman is, supervisors or people who check, right? What do they call them? Enforcers. Mamuna lahalkos lanosh, people, you can give malchus lanosh, the people who cheat. How are you supposed to set up people to do that? They may not got He says like this. So the first brisa says that you shouldn't have dishonest weights and measures. So therefore, they set up supervisors to go around and check. Enforcers like police go and check these kind of, make sure everything is honest. Okay, they may have got them, but you don't set up supervisors to check the prices. In other words, with the whole idea of what did they have during the Nixon administration, where they had price regulations? They didn't have. So you don't do that. says the prices, let the market determine the prices. You can't fix prices, right? There are times when governments do that, where they fix the prices. For staples, they do. Here. Yeah, for certain staples, they do. That's right, milk and things like that, bread. So, but he says, but the Gemara first says that you set up supervisors to check the weights and scales, right? The measures, but not for the prices. Right? But price fixing is not done. The Bein Nasiya in the king's or the exilarch's house, right? Nasiya Ukimiya Gardaman, they did set up these supervisors for the weights and measures. Bein Lemidas, Bein Lasharim, both for measures and for prices. They wanted to have price fixing. Amalei Shmuel. So Shmuel said to Karna was like a Talmud of his, who go out, Tanilu, teach them that's improper. Tanilu, teach them, Mamidna Gardim Levidos. You set up these supervisors for measures, they Mamidna Gardim Lashon, but not for prices. Prices, let the market determine. If somebody, like he says, if somebody wants a lot of money for something, wants too much money, you'll go to another store. That'll determine. That's what makes the prices. Just buying and selling and supply and demand. Let that determine the prices. Anyway, after Shmuel told Karna to go teach them that you only have supervisors for the weights and measures, but not for the prices, Nafik, he went out Darshlahu, and he darshaned not like Shmuel told him. He says, Mamina Gada and Bein Lamidos, Bein Lashar. He went there, he did the reverse of what Shmuel told him to do, and he says you should set up supervisors for both for the weights and measures and also for the prices. Amalei. So Shmuel ridiculed him. Mashim, what's your name? Karna. Karna is like a horn. Take a horn should come out of your eye, and that's what happened. Nafik Karna Bein, a horn came out of his eye. Rashbam brings down that it wasn't just Shmuel. Rav also cursed him in this manner. Maybe the combination of both of them caused that to happen. The EU command Savar. Who did Karna hold like? Why did he not follow what Shmuel told him to do? The Savar Kihoda Amar Rami Barchama. This one Rami Barchama said Amar V'Yasik Mamid Nagadim and Bein Lemidos Bein Lasharm. He said you set up these supervisors for both. He went like this other sheet of Rami Barchama and then Rav Yitzchak, and he didn't follow Shmuel. Right. Why? Because of the crooks, because of the cheats. And if you have to set them up, you have to set up because there are some people some purchasers who are honest and they don't know how to check the prices. And if somebody does what they call price gouging, and charge a lot of money, you might cheat people. So there's different opinions as to what to do. Taner Rabbanan. Haya mavakesh men a litra. If a man said, I would like it, let's call it a litra, is like it's a whatever, a Persian or a Babylonian measure, like a pound or a kilo. Let's call it a kilo. If he asks for a kilo, litra, shokolitra, that's what you have to measure out for him. What's the chiddush in that? We'll see. Chatzi litra, if he says, I want a half a liter, then shokolo, you measure it out from chatzi. Most shokolo chatzi, you measure out from half a liter. Revia liter, if he wants a quarter of a liter, shokolo revia. That's what in other words, if he asks for a kilo, give him a kilo. If he asks him for half a kilo, give him a half a kilo. Measure out a half a kilo. If he wants a quarter of a kilo, measure out a quarter of a kilo. Michael, what's the chiddush in that? What, that you listen to the purchaser? Of course. The metkina mikile ad hachi. You go that far. Meaning, remember, the general opinion in the Mishnah was that you always have to give him a little bit extra. Okay. So if you measure out, let's say the guy says, I would like a kilo, but I want it in, or let's say a pound. I want you to measure out for me, and how many ounces in a pound? 16. Okay. So I measure out 16 times, 16 ounces. Now, again, the purchaser would like that because every time he gets a little extra, so he's going to wind up with a lot more. Whereas if you measure the whole pound, right, in one shot, it won't be that much extra. So how do you know? He says the chiddush is like, let's say can he demand? How far can you demand? Might say, oh, I only take the orders of 10 pounds or more. Can't get a quarter or a half, right? Because that's just no, you have to have that far. That far down you go. You don't have to go any further, but you go that far down. And how do you see? Here is an example. Let's say I want 3/4 of a liter. A liter sounds like liter. It sounds easy to use that word, but it could be a kilo or it's really a weight. So let's say it's a pound or a kilo. Because I want 3/4 of a liter. 1/3. So lo yom shouldn't say shkoli shlosha reva. You shouldn't say, listen, I want 3/4. So measure out for me a quarter, and then then another quarter, and then another quarter. That's not fair. He's going to get too much. He can't demand that. That's what he says. He can't. El, what should he do? He says, lo yomelo shkoli litra achas one at a time, because he's going to wind up. The purchaser's going to wind up cheating the seller. Ella shkol litra. What you do is, how do you do that? He wants 3/4. you put a liter on one side, a liter of the weight, a 1 liter weight on one side. Then the meat, let's say he's buying meat, he puts a quarter of a liter on that side with the meat. So how much is he going to wind up getting? 3/4 of a liter of meat. That's how you do it, right? You have a liter on one side and a quarter of a liter on the side with the meat. So you'll wind up getting 3/4 of a liter of meat. That's what you do it. This way, the seller does not get cheated. That's the way to do it. But you go down that far, and so you can't claim, I don't want quarter weights or that far you have to go. So he says, let's say another case. Let's say he says, I want 10 liters or 10 kilos. He can't say, I want one at a time, like we've said. You can't do one at a time. And each time you'll get a little bit more by the overweight. You got to do it in one shot. One for all. In other words, it wouldn't be fair. You can go down to a liter, half a liter, and a quarter liter. You could have 10 liters, you could have 100 liters, you could have 500 liters of weight if he's buying a lot at one time. But he's saying that if he wants 10 liters, he got to do it in one shot, not in 10 shots. Nefesh Mosnaim, the fulcrum, the handle of the balance scale. Now, when they had balance scales, they had them, right? There were kinds that sit down on something, probably the smaller ones, as we'll see, but the bigger ones, they had them suspended from the ceiling. So Nefesh Mosnaim, it's got to be 3 tvachim. Now, these are amounts that you have to have enough room for the balance scale to move. Let's say you had a low ceiling, right? And the balance scale didn't move too far. So you get cheated, right? Because it didn't move all the way. So he's giving you amounts that how much room do you have to allow for the balance scale to move? So he says, Nefesh Mosnaim, the nefesh, or the handle, the fulcrum Mosnaim, from which there's a beam suspended, and then the ropes hang down with the pans from there. So Nefesh Mosnaim Fluyabav's got to be hanging three tvachim, gimel tvachim suspended. It's also got to be 3 tvachim from the ground. You got to be able to go up, and you got to be able to go all the way down. So you got to have 3 tvachim, right? The kana umisna, and the beam and the rope also shalosh the kana umisna shala shnei masar tvachim. It's got to be a total of 12 tvachim, meaning the beam has got to be 4 tvachim wide, and the ropes hanging down also have to be 4. So it's 4, 4, and 4 is 12. That's if you're talking about, let's say, heavy things. We didn't describe yet what the heavy things are, but let's say those heavy things. V'shel smarim. Let's say there were wool dealers, wool manufacturers, so that the wool doesn't weigh that much, right? Or shel sgogan, or glass blowers, glass manufacturers. Fluyabав doesn't have to be as big. It's got to be hanging. The fulcrum has to be hanging suspended from the ceiling, at least shnei tvachim. At least these are minimal amounts. From the ground 2 tvachim. And the beam together with the and the ropes, the total has to be 9 tvachim, meaning 3, 3, and 3 versus 4, 4, and 4 in the first case. Shechem Bani, let's say a makolet guy who doesn't have really a lot of heavy stuff there, small stuff, a shel balabayis, or a regular homeowner who's selling his stuff. Only has to be suspended 1 tefach in the air. Gavoa min haaretz tefach, 1 tefach off the ground. V'kana misah shala shisha tvachim, 2, 2, and 2. V'shel turtni. What about the goldsmiths? Here come the diamond dealers like Kurt, right? How big does that have to be? Those are small, right? So Fluyabava Shoshes was only got to be hanging in the air 3 finger breadths. Doesn't have to be that big, because that stuff you're selling very small amounts, right? Doesn't have to, the scale doesn't have to go up and down so much. Enough 3 finger breadths. Roman art it's the same thing. It's always the amount suspended from the ceiling and from the ground is the same amount of 3 finger breadths. Any of that. How long does the beam, the lever, and the rope set down? He says, I don't know how much. It's a smaller amount. Obviously it's a smaller amount. Kurt will show us exactly how much. So what about the first case? You said for wool dealers and glass blowers, it's only got to be whatever 2 tvachim, and for shopkeepers and balabatim homeowners 1 tefach, and for goldsmiths it's only got 3 finger breadths. Well, what's the first one? The first one you talked about, it's got to be that it's got to be 3 tvachim from the ceiling, 3 tvachim from the ground. Which one's that? What that's speaking about? Amra Papa, the grumi, or the gear says bigger. Those are spoken about. These are blacksmiths, where they're dealing with heavy metal. heavy metal. Rashbam says in Sarfan Achoshes, the people who, the smiths who make brass or barzol and iron, nefachim shokun chatichas, who take big pieces of mail litter, large amounts. So that's what the first one says. Amar of money, bar patish. Interesting. Whenever you talk about a smith, he has his name patish. Amar patish. Maybe that's why I think it says kederach she'amalin yisur. And just like we talk here about isser of cheating on weights and measures and scales, kacham linyan tumasan. When it comes to tumah, meaning are these things makabel tumah? So Rashbam says it's not makabel tumah unless it's made in with the measures that we just described, with the dimensions we just described, because then it's not a proper kli. If it's not a kli, it's not makabel tumah. That's what he's kach amru linyan tumasan. The aim makabel tumah. It may not suin kach the lo chashivi kli. It's not considered a kli, a vessel. Even though it's if you're not allowed to use it, not considered a kli. It has no meaning, and therefore it's not makabel tumah. What's the chiddush? Is my kamashman. What's Rav Mani Bar Patish teaching me that it comes to kalim? It's also not makabel tumah. It's not a kli. Tanina, we learned in Mesechus kalim chut masnayim, the rope, the string of the balance scale shachamani b'shal balabatim tefach. It's exactly what we just said. So we saw it by kalim also, that how much does it have to be considered a kli? So what's Rav Mani Bar Patish teaching me? Isn't it a beferish mishnah in kalim that it's got to be one tefach? Those are the dimensions, Mr. Shalom, and therefore presumably the other ones, the larger ones for glass blowers and wool dealers and smiths of all kinds, proportionally it'll be the same thing. If it doesn't have that measure, it's not considered a kli. So what's Rav Mani Bar Patish teaching me? So he says, the answer is in the Mishnah Kalim, it doesn't talk about the lever, the beam, and the ropes. It only talks about the how far it's suspended from the top. Is a tefach. How far does it have to be suspended from the top, from the ceiling, and from the ground? It doesn't talk about the size of the ropes on which the pans are suspended by, and the beam or the lever, and that's why Rav Mani Bar Patish tells us that all these rules apply by kalim as well for makabel tumah, as well as the rules about weights and measures here, not cheating. Tanabanim, einos mishkos lo b'shel ba'atz. You don't make mishkos, you don't make weights out of tin, below shalaver, not out of lead, below shal gistron. Gistron is an alloy of two or more different kinds of metals. Below shasharmin metachas, not other kinds of metals. Why? Because they erode with time. As you use them more, they erode. These things lose weight. That's what happens. That's why you have to have people checking them, because they can easily get eroded. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And each one box had a brass plate.
Right. How much it weighs? Yeah, but if you use them too much, he's telling you, if you use them a lot, they could with time, they get eroded. So he says you shouldn't make it out of those materials. You could use it stone. Stone is good. Stone doesn't get eroded. Or glass. Interesting that glass also doesn't erode as easily as kinds of metals. So that's what you should make them out of. Despite the fact that supervisors come and check them and they're stamped as being kosher, the half shon. Ein osin a machak. Machak, modern Hebrew machak is an eraser, right? Machak, it means what they use is like a stick that's used to level off the produce. You buy, let's say, seeds or wheat or something, small stuff, dry measure, and they pile it up. That's a machat. Machat with the test. This is machak. Limchok, to blot out, to erase. So here you're erasing the pile, the heap, right? So he says when you make the stick that's enos memachik shel glass, you don't make it out of a gourd. Neshu call it's too light. If it's too light, it's not going to erase or remove the heat properly, and the seller will, if it's in a place where they do use the machak, where they mark off the heat. If you buy today, he says, I want a volume. The volume is whatever it is, a liter, right? And you're not going, and it's piled up high, so you want to erase that off. You want to knock that off and remove it. So you don't make it out of something light, neshu cow, because it's too light, and therefore it doesn't go into the measure very well, and the seller loses out because he's giving too much produce. Well, don't use a metal one, because the metal goes down deep into the liter volume, right? It gets into the container, and you'll take too much, and then the buyer will get cheated. So you can make it out of olive wood, v'shel egos, or nut wood, v'shel shikmor, sycamore wood, v'shel ashpuro, which is translated as boxwood. Those kind of woods are average. They're not too light, not too heavy. Pardon?
We don't see that they tap down the cleat. Where you put like flour in you tap it down.
Make sure it all goes down. Yeah, well, well, we talked before the other day. On yesterday's app, we talked about how you have to clean out the measures, right? Every so often, depending on how much usage there is, to make sure that nothing is holding it in. Meaning, why do you tap it down? Maybe because it was a little bit wet and something got stuck to the side or whatever it is. Presumably, they did that also. That was understood that you did if the container would not be full, that would be cheating also. It's the same idea. He doesn't say it here, but he said that you got to make sure that your weights, that your measures. Let's say if you use measures on liquid stuff and things get stuck to it, that's not fair because then the buyer's getting cheated. So the Gemara already discussed that.
We see that you level it off.
Right.
And if you tap it down, you'll see that it
maybe.
goes down.
Presumably you have to do that too. Yeah. Presumably you should do that as well. Yeah. All right. Don't make it machik. Now machik is a stick basically. Think of it as a ruler. So you shouldn't have one side thicker and a level. That's a level, right? Shouldn't have a level we think of as level with the liquid in there and all that, but it's a leveler. We'll call it a leveler. You shouldn't make one side thicker and one side thinner. Why? So he says that and you shouldn't make it one side thick and one side thin because you're going to get cheated. How do you get cheated on that? So Rashbam says because the side that's thinner goes deeper into the produce and knocks out a lot, and therefore the seller will get cheated. And the one that's thick doesn't go in so far, and the other way around. If it goes in too deep, then he's taking away, and the buyer will get cheated. If it's thick and doesn't go in deep enough, the buyer's going to wind up with more produce, and the seller gets cheated, right? So, in other words, because if you do that, when you buy, you're going to use the thicker one, so you'll wind up with more. When you sell, you're going to use the shorter side, you'll give the buyer less. So, in order to avoid that, you should do this. You should have the leveler that you use. Both sides should be the same thickness. So that's why it's don't do it quickly. If you do it real quick, he's not going to really remove the entire pile, and the seller will get cheated. Right? That's good for the purchaser. But don't do it too slowly. If you do it too slowly, then he's going to really be careful and make sure there's no pile there. All he's going to get, even what's in there will get lost a little bit. He won't give him a full measure, and that's bad for the mocher. Al kulan, on all these rules about using a thicker, thinner one, or how fast you should go. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zakir said, "Oili im omer, woe unto me if I tell them these rules." In other words, I don't want to tell them these rules because I'm suggesting to them ways to cheat, right? Oili im omer, oili im lo omer, and if I don't tell them, then I'm not admonishing them properly. Im omer, if I tell them shemi yom l'ramon, the cheats will learn how to cheat. I'm giving them some advice. Hey, you want to cheat? Use a thin side. Use the thin side when you want to sell, and when you buy, use the thick side. So I'm afraid to tell them because the cheats will learn from this. If I don't tell them, Shem Yom Ramon. If I don't tell them, the cheats will think they'll think, oh, they can get away with me. If I don't tell them the rules, the rabbis don't even know. There's so many ways to cheat. They don't even warn us not to cheat. So he didn't know what to do. Say, so what did Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai do at the end? He says, woe unto me if I teach them these rules. Woe unto me if I don't. Amra, did he tell them? Allah Amra. Amra of Shmuel, Bar of Yitzchak. Amra, he told them. He told them the rules. Right? He based it, he told them the rules, and he based his teaching on this pasuk. It says, Ki Yesharim Darchei Hashem, God's ways are straight, just, right? The tzaddikim yochabam, the tzaddikim will follow in God's ways, and the sinners, they will stumble on them. In other words, you got to teach them the right way. if the Ramoim learned from there how to cheat, that's their problem. But I got to teach them the Torah. And the Torah says to be just and make sure you don't cheat. Don't do anything unrighteous when it comes to judgment. How? The Midah Mishka Masura. Pasuk says in Kedoshim, both in Midah means measure, we'll see what kind. Mishka means weight. Masura is also a kind of a measure, mostly a liquid measure, but we'll see what they are. What's the difference between Midah and a Masura? Midah is Midah des Karka. It's measuring out linear, measuring out Karka. If I tell you I'm selling you an acre of land, so I can't cheat. An acre has certain measurements to it, right? Whatever it is, the length and the width. So you got to be honest with them. What does that mean? In the summertime, when the rope that you're measuring with is taut and doesn't give, that's one measure. And when for somebody else, when you're buying, you'd like to use that rope. When it's wet, it gives more and it stretches more. So obviously, you want to use the longer rope when you buy and the shorter rope when you sell. Don't cheat. The mishko, when weight, shelo yatnish of melech. Don't dip your weights in salt, right? Rashbam says that when you dip them in salt, that makes them heavier, right? So who's cheating over here? If you make the weights heavier, the buyer is cheating the seller, right? But Tosfos doesn't like that because he says we're talking here about things where where the seller is cheating basically. So he says that when you dip them in salt, not that they become heavier, but that erodes them. So if you have a 1 kilo weight and you keep it in salt water, right? Eventually it won't be 1 kilo anymore, right? And it's going to be at less, and therefore you're cheating the customer. So whatever it is, don't put it in salt. Whether it adds to it or less to it, you got to keep them honest. But Masura, what does Masura mean? Shelo yartiach. Masura is a liquid measure, as we'll describe. Shelo yarsiach, you shouldn't make it froth. Again, since yarsiach means froth is what do you mean when you pour? Let's say you're selling wine. They didn't have prepackaged bottles and stuff like that. You'd sell the wine, you'd pour it into the guy's container. When you pour it real quick, there's a lot of froth at the top. Later on, it'll settle. But meanwhile, it says, it's full. You get home, a quarter of it is missing, right? That's cheating. So we're talking about that the seller is cheating, and that's why Tosfos prefers to say that when you dip the weights in salt, the seller is cheating, meaning that the weight weighs less. Okay. Listen to Masura. This again, Mida is measuring in linear measure, like when you're measuring land. Mishkal is weight. Masura is also a measure, but what kind of a measure? It's a liquid measure. It's a volume measure. Masura is only 1/36 of a load, very small amount. Of Torah. The Torah says don't cheat, even with such a small measure. Kavachomer for larger liquid measures. Lihin, b'chatzi, now these are liquid measures, but of course, since they're volume measures, they are similar to the dry measures. Except for dry measures, we have different measuring tools, but they are related, as we'll see. That the kav, which is the dry measure, is equal to 4 log, and the hin is 12 log. So he says, if for a 36th of a log, a very small amount, a log is like 6 eggs or something, So if a 36th of that, the Torah's makbid not to cheat. Kavachomer lehin, b'chatzi and a half a hin, shlish and a third of a hin, ravias, and these are measures that we find in the Torah, right? For how much you have to bring with the wine or oil libation, the water libation on sukkahs, what you give with the karbanos. The log, b'chatzi log, certainly a log or a chatzi log, or ravias a log, b'chatzi toman. What's toman? Toman is 1/8 of a log, right? Which is a half a log. And he says that the toman is the equivalent of a half a log, right? Chatzi log is the equivalent of a toman. Chatzi toman is a half of that. So he says if a toman is 1/8 of a kav, again, because a kav has 4 log, and a half a log would be a toma, that's a half a log. Because a half a log, revius log would be a quarter. When we always talk about a revius for kiddush, it means a revius a log, and a toman, which is 1/8 of a kav, which is a half a log. So a toman and a half a log is the same thing. So that toman and chatzi log would be redundant. They'd be the same thing. So he says chatzi toman. On the side, he brings down chatzi log revius with toman and chatzi toman. In the bach, he brings down toman, but toman is really chatzi log. But here he says the chatzi toman, which is 1/8. If a toman is how much is 1/8 of a kav, which is a half a log. So a toman is a half a log, and a chatzi toman is a quarter of a load. A quarter of a load, same as that. But uchla, we'll see. We don't even know what uchla is yet. That's a smaller amount. We'll see what that is. The Gemara is going to talk about that later on. So certainly all these amounts are larger than a masura, which is a 36th of a load. So certainly if the Torah is makban on a 36, it's certainly makban on all these other ones. You shouldn't keep a dishonest measure in your house. Let's say you used to sell stuff and you have measuring cups or weights, whatever. They're not good anymore. They haven't been checked. They got small. You shouldn't even keep it in your house, or you shouldn't keep a bigger one. Sometimes the buyer would walk around with his measuring, with his own weight. And he must, they keep it like in a leather bag so they shouldn't get eroded. You ever see they keep these weights, like you said, they're in containers. They keep them not to get eroded. But whether your weight is heavier or lighter than the standard, you shouldn't have them around at all. It's dishonest to keep them. Even if it's a chamber pot. So, well, I'm keeping this as a chamber pot in my house. It's marked 1 kilo, or let's say one hin or whatever it is, a volume measure or a kav, whatever. So you can't keep, even if you're using it for some other purpose, don't keep it around because there's something dishonest may come of it. That's only in a place where they don't put a hechsher on the scale. They're not marked, with a stamp that they've been checked. In a place where they mark them, a person's not going to buy it. You go into a store and his scale is not marked as approved or stamped or checked by a supervisor, you're not going to use it. So if you have one that's used as a chamber pot or some other purpose, you use it as a paperweight or whatever. If it's not marked as a valid thing, and then they're not going to use it anyway. Even a place, let's say, a place where they don't stamp the namilo amrin eladomansi. That's only if the mandasim, the engineers, that means the people who come around, the supervisors who check them, then you shouldn't use it. Mahan see lesson, but if there's people who check them, then there's no concern. But Lowy, it's not true. Even if there's people who measure them, Lowy, zimnan the mikri ben hashmashos umikri b'shakul. Why? Even because sometimes, even if it's a place where they put a stamp on it, like a hechsher, it's been approved, and this one doesn't have a hechsher, so nobody's going to use it. Not true. Sometimes somebody needs something Erev Shabbos or whatever, he wants to measure it out quickly, and he'll use it. So therefore, don't keep dishonest or scales or weights or measures that are too high or too low. Don't keep them around at all, because they might come to be used even in a place where normally they are stamped and measured and etc. You shouldn't keep a measure which is too big or too small, right, in your house. Even if you use it as a chamber pot, you shouldn't use it because it might come to be used in a dishonest transaction. But you could make, what measures can you keep if they're exact? If you have a saw, which is a large amount, that's 6 kav. Tar kav is 3 kav. Tar kav is like an abbreviation, trey kav, 2 and a kav. Like 2 kav and a third kav, that's 3 kav. Chatzi tar kav, which would be 1.5 kav. Big kav, keep a kav. These are all valid measures. If you have those measures and they're exact, you keep a chatzi kav, a half a kav. The rova and a quarter of a kav. The toman we mentioned before is what? An eighth of a kav, which is a half a load, right? The chatzi toman, half of that. The uchla and an uchla, those are all valid measures. Kama uchla, how much is an uchla? Echem michimish bereva, 1/5 of a quarter. What's 1/5 of a quarter? 1/20th. It's 1/20th of a kav. Wow, that's small. Or mita salach, if you're talking about liquid measure, who also you can make a hin, which is the largest liquid measure. Chatzi and a half a hin, right? Chatzi a hin, ushlishis a hin, right? Like the pasuk says. Hin, v'chatzi hin, ushlishis a hin, v'ravias a hin. The log, a log, right? A log has there are 12 log in a hin. So ravias a hin is 3 log. A log is 1 log. Obviously, it's 1 log. The chatzi log, right? We said before that a log is the equivalent of a kav is 4 log, right? A kav is 4 log. Revias in the log, v'chatzi log, revias and a quarter of a log, with shminas, even an eighth of a log. The echad mishmona, right? The echad mishmona b'shminas, 1/64. Wow, 1/8 of an eighth, right? You have a 1/8, which was zeu kortov. Kortov is always like a drop, a small amount, right? Where do we say if you put kortov shel even a small amount, very small amount. So the Gemara says, when you mentioned all these dry measures and liquid measures, you mentioned a saw, which is 6 kav. You mentioned tarka of 3 kav, chatzi tarka of 1.5 kav, a kav. What about 2 kav? What about a 2 kav? Why not mention kavayim, which is 2 kav? So also because if you have a kav, if you have a 2 kav and a 3 kav, you'll mistake the two. They're too close to one another. But that means that people make a mistake of a third, because 3 kav is 1/3 more than, milabar, it's 1/3 more than 2 kav. So people make a mistake between those. Kav nami, you shouldn't make a kav. Lo love it. Why does because you'll make a mistake of between 1 kav and 1.5 kav. Chatzi tarkav is half of 3 kav, which is 1.5. So if you think people are going to make a mistake between something which is a third off, you shouldn't have a kav either, because you're going to mix that up with a chatzi kav. Ella kavayim, no, that's not. People don't make a mistake. A third difference, people will recognize that. Ella kavayim, the reason why you don't make a 2 kav a measure, because if you make a 2 kav, you'll come to confuse that with a chatzi tarkav, which is 1.5. The reason why you don't use 2 is not because, right? We said before that you don't make 2 because you'll mix it up with a 3 kav. 2 kav mix up with 3 kav. No, 2 kav to 3 kav people aren't going to mix up because it's 1/3 less. A third less people will tell, but they can't make a difference between a quarter. Why? Because if you have 2 kav, you'll mix that up with 1.5 kav. People will make a mistake with a quarter. In other words, if you have 2 kav, that's 1/4 bigger than 1.5 kav, right? 1/4 bigger. So that's too close. People will make a mistake. If that's the case, chatzi tuman. How do you make a mistake? A chatzi tuman. We said a tuman is how much? 1/8 of a kav, right? 1/8 of a kav. But uchla, right? And an uchla, you shouldn't make a chatzi tuman and an uchla. An uchla, we said, is how much? 1/20. Why? Lola of it. You shouldn't make a mistake like that, right? Why? Because a tuman is 1/8 of a kav. A chatzi tuman is how much? A 1/16 of a kav, right? Chatzi tuman. We said you can make a chatzi tuman. The last words on Pei Testament base was chatzi tuman. Chatzi tuman is a 1/16 of a kav, and an ochel is 1/20 of a kav. Well, the difference between 1/20 of a kav and 16 is less than a quarter. So if people make a mistake of a quarter, you shouldn't make those two either. Low of it. You have these very small measures used presumably for gold and diamonds and things like that. People are bakim in that. They know exactly. Those are when they're that small, they're so tiny, then people know and they're not going to make a mistake. When it's larger measures, they might make a mistake between something which is a quarter bigger and versus something which is a quarter smaller than that. So the Gemara says shlishas in revias in law of it. You shouldn't make shlishas. If you're saying people make a mistake between something which is a quarter bigger, so if you have shlishas in, how much is shlishas in? 4 log. How much is revias in? 3 log. Okay, so you shouldn't have those two measures. Why? Because people will make a mistake. Because the shlisha sahin, which is 4 log, is only a quarter bigger than the reviya sahin. So you shouldn't have that low of it. It's even Dapim mikdash, but they were in the base of mikdash. In the base of mikdash, we said shlisha sahin lo reviya sahin like kevas yayin, right? We talk about the shlisha sahin reviya, and it's in the chumash. They use in the base of mikdash. So since they were there, the Rabban didn't make a gzeira. So the mikdash nami liksa. So why weren't they gozer in the mikdash? You shouldn't use that, even if that was the prescribed method. But people make a mistake. Kohanim's reason. Kohanim are very industrious. They're very careful. They're not going to make a mistake. So the base mikdash, they weren't gozer. The Torah said they were in the base mikdash. They weren't gozer because the Kohanim are there. And since they were using them in the base of mikdash, we're not gozer here either. So we're not gozer on very small measures because people are careful of that. And measures that we use in the base mikdash, we're not gozer on that either. But otherwise, that's why they didn't have a 2 kav measure, because you'll confuse that with a 1.5 kav measure. All right, those are the honest measures that you can keep in your house. All right, we'll pick them here tomorrow. Mr. Shem, have a good day.